The next step in adding realism to your sword is to add signs of wear and scratches and lots of small details so that you can take your sword from looking something like this to something more like this. And you can see in here where we've added some ornate details. The fabric has a slight texture and there's some signs of wear and the sword looks a bit battered. There's even some text engraved into it as well. But to do this, you have to unwrap your sword first using the UV editor so that the 2D images can understand how your sword looks like when it's unfolded. To UV map any piece of geometry in 30 seconds or less, you go to Edit, Delete All by Type History, Modify, Freeze Transformations, UV, the UV Editor, UV Automatic Mapping, assign a material by going to Object Mode, clicking on the geometry, choosing a color in the Attribute Editor, go to File, choose a file. If your material looks too zoomed in, go to the Color Output, go to Place 2D Texture, increase Repeat UV as needed. If it's still stretched, click on this button in the UV Toolkit, drag select all of your geometry, resize it out like this. The first thing I'm going to do is create a material override so that I can see a checkerboard on the entire sword to help me make sure that all the UVs are scaled in correct proportion to each other and to give me a nice visual aid to make sure that nothing is stretched, which you will be difficult to see by using images alone. To do a material override on this sword, select your geometry, make sure you have not selected the floor. I have selected the floor, so I'll hold Shift to deselect it. I'll go to my render layers up here, which is the clapperboard with the blue layers on them. In this window, simply click on the diamond or plane with a plus on it. This will add your geometry to this layer. I'm going to rename it Checker layer. Then you need to tell it what geometry to have applied to it. If you right click, create collection, and over here immediately hit add. As long as your geometry is selected, hit add, and you'll see all of your geometry is added to this here. Next, you're going to want to create an override material. So you can right click, create material override, click on the override material, choose something very simple. I'm going to use a Lambert material, which won't be shiny at all and will allow you to see the test texture well. On the right hand side, you should be able to see the attributes for your Lambert material. I'm going to call it Lambert Checker. Go to the color checkerboard, and usually we go to file, but now for once we can actually go to checker. You then should see this material on the sword. If you don't, you need to just change which layer you can see. So at the moment I can see my whole scene, and then if I click on the eyeball down here for my checkerboard layer, all of your lights will disappear and the floor and things like that, and you'll just see the sword on its own in your scene. So this layer acts as like an alternate reality so that you can switch quickly between all of your finished shaders and between this checkerboard material to assist you. Our goal is to have our geometry complete with squares like this piece of geometry all over it, all to the same scale. Before we close the render layers, I just want to adjust the brightness and contrast of the checkerboard. So click on the output here for the override material, and you should take you to the checkerboard material you've put on. Click on the output for color now and decrease color 1 right the way down so that the white squares are quite a lot darker. I'm also just going to increase the brightness of the dark squares slightly so they're grey. This helps us see the lines on your sword clearer in the UV editor. You can now close down your render editor. Now go to your UV editor here, and you can see an object like this and how it looks in your UV editor. It looks nothing like this shape, but the easiest thing to do is to automatic map it. So you can go to UV, automatic, and it will do its best to unfold this shape in here. Sometimes when you do this, your geometry will look very stretched. I'll just demonstrate this briefly. So if when using automatic mapping, your geometry is still stretched and the squares look quite stretched on it, you can go to modify, freeze transformations, and then UV map it again a second time. So hit automatic mapping again, and it will then use the actual size of the sword blade in here and UV map it properly. This is a common problem that my students have, and that's how to fix it, is to freeze transformations first. So I'm now going to select the entire sword, and you can see how in here none of the pieces look like a sword at all. I'm going to go to UV, automatic mapping. You can see all of the UVs stacked on top of each other here. If you're not using an NVIDIA graphics card, it can be quite laggy in the UV editor, so you may have to do things one at a time. Our next task is to try to scale the UVs so that all the pieces of the sword have squares of equal size all the way across. To do this, I'll first go to the checker material. So if you click on an object and keep clicking the right arrow until you get to the very end, you should see your checkerboard material for this render layer, and then go to the input for color. There's something called place 2D texture. This will increase the detail across all of your geometry that has this material applied to it. So if you go to repeat UV, and for my checkerboard, I'm going to increase this up to 8. And you can immediately then see how small the squares are on this piece of geometry compared to here. This means that this geometry gets a lot more detail than that. Things will look a lot sharper, and the depth of the bump maps will be different, and normal maps may be different in between these two. So we have to be careful and try to scale these proportionally. So you could resize the actual UVs. To move your UVs around, you can click on this button here, drag select all the pieces of this sword, hit R for resize, and you can resize these. If your tools in the UV editor are stuck to set increments and jumping around like mine here, you can simply go to Tools, Move, and hit the options box for that, for example, and hit Reset Tool, and it should then move smoothly. So I'm going to find the largest pieces of geometry, which would be the blades of the sword here. And I'm going to try and make all the other pieces of the sword smaller so that they match. If you make your geometry larger than the area that you can see in your UV editor here, it will be fine in Maya, but the texture painting softwares like Mudbox won't like it. If you're going to do this in Mudbox, you have to keep all your geometry in here like this, which is what I'll do. It's easy to scale them all up later if you need it. So I'm just going to go around to all my geometry and scale them down using this button so that the squares are roughly the same size across the object. This piece of geometry here is looking quite confused and has a lot of pieces that seem to be all very disjointed. And as it's a cylinder, an easy thing to do would be to use cylindrical mapping. So you can go to UV, cylindrical, and you see this appear. This is the least intuitive thing I've ever seen, but you want this cylinder to be wrapping around at the same angle that your cylinder is here. So you can click on the red T at the bottom, or find a little red T shape like that. It brings up a rotation and scale axis. You then must click on this light blue circle that you can just about see there. Then it brings up the rotation axis clearly. You can now rotate this. I'm going to hold down J first, and whilst holding J, I can rotate this way and rotate it this way. And so your cylindrical map looks like that. In my UV editor, I can see that this object looks quite compressed, and the checkers squares on here look a little bit squashed as well. So you can resize it using this by going back to the square over here and just stretching the UVs out until they look fairly square on your geometry. When you've done that, if you want to go back to object mode to get rid of that, you can, and then go to your shell selection tool, click on the shell for this geometry, and you can see it's significantly larger than the checkerboard plane in there, which means it won't work well in something like Mudbox and some game engines. So you can scale that right the way down and until the scale of the squares are about the right size. Next, for this piece, I'll now show you how to stitch geometry together. So first of all, I'm going to click on this button here, which shades in all of your faces so it's easier to see in the UV editor. At the moment, the checkerboard doesn't line up. So if I have a scratch going across the top, the scratch won't continue down the side, and it may look a little bit disjointed, and you'll see like seams and problems across your geometry when you have these thick lines. So when you click on your object, even if it's not filled in with color, you can still see some white lines. These white lines are where the seams are, and it's sometimes a good idea to join them together, almost like a net for a cardboard box. This shape is significantly more detailed than a cardboard box, but it can still be joined together. To do this, I'm just going to click on my shaded view here, and I'm going to go to edge mode, and this edge here is what the camera is going to be seeing quite a lot. So if I select this thick edge and move across and double click on the thick edge further away, it will join up the edge loops in between. In your UV editor, you can sew them together, just like if you're making clothing or something. If you scroll down in your UV toolkit, which I have joined up to the right hand side of my UV editor, to do this you can drag the UV toolkit until you see the blue area here and it snaps in, and then go to where it says cut and sew. All you really want to do is use a stitch together tool. You very rarely ever use sew because that just stretches things horribly, so you can see what happens here. But if you hit stitch together, it will move the geometry around and join it up properly. So my stitch together didn't work there, and it was because I had smooth preview enabled. If I disable smooth preview by hitting 1 on the keyboard and try that again by selecting the orange edge and then going to stitch together, it will then join up properly. And you can see that the checkerboards go over the edge neatly. So if there was like a blood splat or something like that on the corner of the sword, it would go neatly over the edge on both sides. I'm just going to join up the other sides, starting with this edge here, and shift double clicking to the other side, and then going to stitch together. And you can see it gets joined onto the side over here. I'll do the same with the other side. So just treat it like a cardboard box and just try and join up the main edges, stitch together. And then underneath. That's as far as you can stitch it together, because if you try to attach this side over here to this side over here, it would obviously go in through the geometry. When you see any red or pink shapes in here, it means there's a face that's going the wrong way and it's all going a bit crazy. So you cannot stitch these together because that would be impossible to unfold a 2D shape in that way. And now if you were to move your UV shell across like this, you'll see the squares all line up neatly. It'll be perfect. I'm now going to scale it down so that it gets the same amount of texture budget as any other part of the sword. One of the main reasons for this is that even though this part of the sword may look more detailed, it would make the rest of the sword look less detailed, which can be problematic. If you go to these spiral shapes here, you'll see they have lots of seams going on, and you will definitely see this in the final render. So I'm actually going to select all of these spiral shapes. When they're selected, I'll go to combine them, which is mesh combine, as this will be a lot easier to work with combined geometry. I then go to UV, cylindrical, click on the red T, click on the blue circle, hold J on the keyboard to rotate this in increments so that it is vertical, rotate this sideways, and you will see some lag because this will have quite a massive impact on your graphics card. And then you'll need to click on the UV shell, select the entire object like this and scale it down significantly. Also make sure that you have hit 1 on the keyboard. Do not try to UV map smooth geometry. That will cause even more lag. So if you hit 1 on the keyboard, it will make sure that your geometry has not been smooth previewed, and it will be a lot better. These pieces of geometry look very stretched. In fact, so does this one. I'm just going to stretch this that way. And to unstretch these, make sure you've hit 1 on the keyboard and then use this tool here to select everything, and you should be able to stretch it like this to ensure that everything is squares. You've now done a basic UV unwrap on your geometry. You can tweak this when you add all of your details later on, but this is a good start. In the next tutorial, we'll focus on adding the actual materials themselves and tweaking the size of the UVs as needed.